June 28, 1914. One bullet, one archduke, one assassin. But buried beneath that single act lay the seeds of 17 million deaths. 17 million human beings who never saw the gun, never knew the name of the man who fired it, never understood why their world had to burn. They died because of decisions made by a handful of men in closed rooms, whose faces they would never see, whose names they would never know. History is not written by crowds, it is written by choices, and those choices are signed in mahogany offices, while the blood runs in muddy trenches. This is the story of the blood they never saw, and the signatures that signed it into existence. 3,000 years ago, an Assyrian king named Ashurbanipal decorated his palace with the flayed skins of his enemies. He called it the glory of empire. Today, we call it monstrous. But here is what haunts me. Who told him he was righteous? Who drew the maps that said this land is yours, and that life is yours to take? The architect of war is not merely a politician. He is a monarch signing orders from a gilded chamber, a president authorizing an invasion from an air-conditioned desk, a diplomat calculating risk in a language the victims will never speak, a corporation fulfilling a weapons contract with both sides, a newspaper headline that turns a distant people into a looming threat. This is not a story for the faint of heart, because the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. War is rarely fate. More often, it is a decision made by the few, paid for by the many. And the terrifying part? The decision-makers almost never pay the price. So, let me show you the map. Let me show you the room. Let me show you the signature. Because once you see how the machinery works, you will never watch the news the same way again. November 1095, Clermont, France. Pope Urban II stands before a crowd of nobles and clergy. His message: the Holy Lands are under threat. The faithful must rise. The response was staggering. Within months, armies were marching east. What followed was 2 centuries of crusades, millions dead. But the reality was far more complex than a simple rescue mission. Christians, Muslims, and Jews had coexisted in Jerusalem for generations. Urban's call was not merely religious, it was political. Europe was fractured. The Pope needed a unifying cause. A distant enemy was forged in rhetoric, and millions marched toward a war they did not understand. Think about that for a moment. A single speech in a French field created an enemy that didn't exist, and 200 years of blood followed. That is the power of the invented enemy. And here is the paradox. The men who answered Urban's call believed they were choosing salvation. They did not know they were choosing slaughter. We tell ourselves this was the medieval mind. But how many modern wars began with an enemy invented by a headline, a speech, a dossier? How many are being invented right now, in rooms we cannot enter, on screens we scroll past? The map changes, the room changes, the signature changes, but the machinery never stops. June 28, 1914. Sarajevo. Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist, fires 2 shots. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary falls. Principa believed he was striking a blow for liberation. But here's the tragedy. Franz Ferdinand was one of the few voices in Vienna urging caution towards Serbia. He opposed war. He favored reform. He was killed by the very fire he had tried to contain. What followed was not inevitable. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, deliberately designed to be unacceptable. On July 28th, the declaration of war was signed. In Berlin, the Kaiser gave Austria a blank check of unconditional support. In St. Petersburg, the Tsar ordered mobilization. In Paris, the cabinet met in secret. In London, Foreign Secretary Gray stared at a map of Europe and reportedly said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." The European powers had spent decades weaving a web of alliances, secret agreements, and military timetables. They knew, many of them knew, that a localized conflict could engulf the continent. And still, the machinery ground forward. The result? 17 million dead, 20 million wounded. 4 empires collapsed. A generation of European youth buried in fields they had never heard of. Try to picture it. The population of London, gone. The population of New York, gone. Every seat in Wembley Stadium filled with the dead, 10,000 times over. And then came Versailles. The treaty that ended the war did not end the grievances. It imposed crushing reparations on Germany, redrew borders with little regard for ethnicity, and left a nation humiliated and economically broken. Many historians argue that Versailles did not prevent another war. It fertilized the soil for one. The signature on that treaty was supposed to be the last. It was only the beginning. 1939. German troops cross into Poland. The world calls Hitler a madman. But madness rarely rises alone. The Treaty of Versailles had left Germany economically shattered, territorially amputated, and nationally humiliated. Into that void stepped a man who promised restoration, revenge, and greatness. And millions, desperate, angry, fearful, believed him. Yet the ascent was not unstoppable. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich. He met Hitler in a room. He examined a map. He signed an agreement ceding Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for what he called peace for our time. He returned to London waving that paper. The crowd cheered. The photograph made history. But the paper was already worthless. 6 months later, Hitler swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia. The policy of concession had fed the predator. The Second World War claimed 60 million lives. Among them, 6 million Jews systematically murdered in the Holocaust. And in August 1945, 2 American atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In Hiroshima alone, some 70,000 died instantly. By year's end, the toll had risen to roughly 140,000. President Truman, sitting in the Oval Office, signed the order from thousands of miles away. He argued the bombs prevented a costly invasion of Japan. Others have debated that calculus for decades. What is beyond debate is the horror. 200,000 civilians, mothers, children, workers, incinerated in seconds by a decision made in a room they would never enter. The bomb was never used in war again. Not because humanity became wise, but because humanity saw what it could do. And even then, the question remains. If Hiroshima had not demonstrated the abyss, would the nuclear powers of later decades have hesitated? The map had changed. The room had changed. But the signature? The signature was always waiting. October 1962. Cuba. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood at the brink of nuclear war. Soviet missiles in Cuba, an American naval blockade, secret letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev. The world held its breath. In the White House Situation Room, Kennedy sat before maps showing nuclear strike radii across the American East Coast. In the Kremlin, Khrushchev received intelligence that American forces were preparing to invade Cuba within 48 hours. Both men had generals urging them to strike first. Both had nuclear launch codes within arm's reach. One wrong move, one misunderstood telegram, one aggressive maneuver, and the world would have ended before most people knew why. What ended the crisis wasn't military victory. It was compromise. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles. Kennedy secretly agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey 6 months later and pledged not to invade Cuba. Both leaders faced pressure from hardliners in their own camps. Both chose pullback over annihilation. The world survived, by a margin so thin it still terrifies. But how many near misses never made the headlines? In 1983, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov received a satellite warning of an American nuclear launch. He judged it a malfunction and refused to report it upward. Had he followed protocol, the Soviet Union might have retaliated. One man's intuition may have prevented global catastrophe. We did not survive the Cold War because our leaders were infallible. We survived, in part, because of luck. And then there was Vietnam. 3 million Vietnamese dead. 58,000 Americans. The justification was the domino theory. If Vietnam fell to communism, all of Southeast Asia would follow. Vietnam did fall. Laos fell. Cambodia collapsed into genocide. But the theory had been used to justify a war of staggering brutality, and the regional catastrophe that followed was arguably worsened, not prevented, by American intervention. 3 million lives, a theory, a miscalculation, a decision made in rooms where the air conditioning drowned out the screams. The map was redrawn, the room was cleared. But the blood? The blood never dries. Wars are fought with ideology and fear, but they are also fueled by profit. During the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s, Texaco, an American oil company, supplied Franco's forces with fuel on credit, despite American neutrality laws. German and Italian aircraft bombed Spanish cities using gasoline, sold by a democracy that claimed to oppose fascism. Franco won. 500,000 Spaniards died. And business continued. During the Second World War, the German conglomerate IG Farben manufactured Zyklon B, the poison used in Nazi gas chambers. After the war, the company was dismantled. Its descendants, Bayer, BASF, Hoechst, remain among the world's largest chemical and pharmaceutical firms. They did not commit the Holocaust, but the same industrial infrastructure that produced death on an unimaginable scale now produces the aspirin in your cabinet and the plastics in your home. The line between civilian industry and war machine has always been thinner than we admit. In Vietnam, Dow Chemical manufactured Agent Orange, a defoliant sprayed across millions of acres. Decades later, Vietnamese civilians still suffer from its genetic legacy. In the 2000s, private military contractors operated in Iraq under rules looser than those binding uniformed soldiers. They were paid with taxpayer money. Some committed atrocities. Few faced justice. War, it turns out, is not merely tragedy. For some, it is a business model. This is not a conspiracy. It is an incentive. When Lockheed Martin's stock rises after a missile strike, when reconstruction contracts are signed before the rubble cools, when a nation's economy depends on arms exports, war becomes not just thinkable, but profitable. Not inevitable, but tempting. The map shows borders, the room shows balance sheets, and somewhere between them, the signature becomes very easy to give. 1994, Rwanda. Over the course of 100 days, Hutu extremists murdered approximately 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus. They used machetes, they used clubs, they used fire. The United Nations had peacekeepers on the ground, roughly 2,500 troops. They were ordered not to intervene. The international community watched. Some would later say they did not understand the scale. Others say they did not care to. The math is merciless. 800,000 deaths in 100 days means roughly one life extinguished every 10 seconds. For 100 days. Imagine a classroom vanishing every minute. Imagine a city the size of San Francisco erased in 3 months. And the world changed the channel. A decade later, Darfur. 300,000 dead. 3 million displaced. The United States called it genocide. The United Nations issued reports. Nobody sent the armies needed to stop it. In Syria, beginning in 2011, 500,000 people died. 13 million were driven from their homes. The world held meetings. Russia vetoed. China abstained. The killing continued. Since 2014, Yemen has endured what the United Nations has called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Famine, cholera, airstrikes, 400,000 dead. Saudi Arabia, armed by the West. The Houthis, armed by Iran. And in the middle, a civilian population paying the price for a proxy war they did not choose. These are not forgotten because they are small. They are forgotten because they are inconvenient. No oil that justifies intervention. No ideology that galvanizes the public. No cameras where the world is looking. The Rwandans died with machetes while the world had satellites. We did not fail to see. We failed to act. The map was there. The room was there. But the signature? The signature never came. John McCrae, Canadian poet and military doctor. In 1915, he wrote in Flanders Fields after burying a friend on the Western Front. He died of pneumonia in 1918, not in battle, but in the shadow of it. His poem became the anthem of a generation that marched into machine guns, believing it was glorious. Sadako Sasaki, 2 years old when the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. She survived the blast. 10 years later, she developed leukemia from the radiation. She began folding paper cranes, believing that 1,000 would grant her a wish. She died at 12. Her cranes are still displayed at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. She did not choose the war. She did not choose the bomb. She chose hope. And hope was not enough. Phan Thi Kim Phuc, 9 years old in 1972. A photograph captured her running naked down a highway, her skin burning from napalm. The image helped turn American public opinion against the war. She survived. She became a UNESCO ambassador. But the war continued for 3 more years. The photograph saved no one that day. Alan Kurdi, 3 years old, Syrian. His body washed up on a Turkish beach in 2015. He had drowned with his family trying to reach Europe. The image circled the globe in hours. Politicians expressed sorrow. Policies barely changed. The boats kept sinking. The children kept dying. Some images shock the world. Few change it. These are not numbers. These are the faces behind the signatures you will never see. The blood behind the maps you will never study. The screams behind the rooms you will never enter. And they are asking you, across a century of silence, to remember their names. From Ashurbanipal to Putin, from Urban II to the war rooms of today, from Franz Ferdinand to the border checkpoints of Eastern Europe, the architecture is the same. Fear, ambition, ideology, miscalculation, a closed room, a map, a pen, a signature, and then the graves. But here is what is different now. You can see. You have cameras in your pocket. You have access to archives, to testimony, to satellite imagery. You can watch a child die in Gaza in real time. You can see a Ukrainian apartment building crumble. You can read the declassified cables. You can know. And that knowledge is both a gift and a burden. The question is no longer, why do wars happen? The question is, why do we watch? A politician chooses war when he believes the public will permit it, when the media will frame it, when the arms industry will supply it, when history, he believes, will forgive it. But history is not written by politicians. It is written by the mothers at the graveside, the children in the refugee camp, the cities turned to dust, the earth that absorbs the blood. The real history is not in the archives. It is in the ground. The next war will not be decided by you, but your silence or your voice will be part of the calculation. And that, unlike so much else, is a choice that belongs to you. Subscribe if you still believe the truth matters.